Ahoy class, let's take a look at CameraSim, an online camera simulator. So to begin playing with this, you're going to click Start the Sim. You'll see here we have a moving subject, which is helpful for illustrating how shutter speed will work here. So beginning from the top, we've got a lighting indicator. So we've got the level sunniness, the level of brightness. So you can make it kind of dim, brighten it up a little bit. So here this is emulating sunny, mostly sunny, partly cloudy, overcast, bright indoors, dim indoors, etc. So it's just an estimate of what the typical lighting is in this situation. So we're going to go with mostly sunny. Distance from subject. So we can zoom in real close or we can zoom out kind of far. We'll start off in the middle. And then focal length. So this would be the length of your lens. If you're using a DSLR, you often have either a zoom lens or interchangeable lenses so that you can change the focal length. So this is a typical 35 millimeter, and we can zoom in to a 55 or zoom out 18 millimeter. So this 18 millimeter would be a wide angle. We've got a wide shot right here. We're zooming in. 35 is basically what's natural to the human eye on a full frame sensor. DSLRs typically have either a full frame sensor, which matches a 35 millimeter, or a crop sensor, which would be a little smaller. But on a full frame, this would be what's normal to the human eye. And then 55, zooming way in. This would be considered telephoto, zooming in for it. So once again, we're going to put this back in the middle. And then right here we have different modes. So on most DSLR and point and shoot cameras, you'll have P for program, AV for aperture priority, TV for shutter priority, and M for manual. So right here, this is on program mode. So we can only adjust the ISO. So we've got our ISO, aperture, shutter speed, and then you have the ability to have it on a tripod or not on a tripod. So notice when it's not on a tripod, it's shaking a little bit because naturally you're going to have the human body is going to be moving a little bit while holding the camera. So if you were trying to take a shot and you want it to be crystal clear, ideally you would use a tripod to hold it steady. But I'll leave it here since most of you probably won't be using a tripod. However, if you can, I would highly recommend it. So first, exploring ISO, notice that when we go all the way over here, notice these settings are changing, but pay attention to the image. So we're going to click snap photo. See this grain, see these dots here? That is called grain or noise. So traditionally in film photography, it would be called graininess, grain. In digital photography, it's usually referred to as noise. I'm going to click review, return to viewfinder. So now let's go take a picture at 800. See, we still have a little bit of noise. It's not nearly as bad as it was. And then going all the way down to 100, no visible noise. So ISO is the sensitivity of the sensor, or if you were using a film camera, the film to light. The higher the ISO, the more sensitive to light the sensor will be. So like the more light it will pick up. But the trade-off is that the higher the sensitivity, the more noise you're going to get. So ideally, in most situations, you want to shoot with as low an ISO as possible to avoid that digital noise, unless you're intentionally going with that for an aesthetic reason. Now switching to aperture priority, in this mode you can see that you can't adjust the shutter speed. The camera will automatically decide the best setting for shutter speed, but you can adjust ISO and aperture. So I'm going to lower the aperture all the way down to 100. The aperture, sometimes referred to as the f-stop, which is why this F is right here, refers to the size of the opening of the lens. It's like, imagine you've got like a little keyhole, that can be like the size of, I mean, it would be smaller than a dime, but just imagine, going from the size of a dime or a pinpoint to a quarter. Just, and then this isn't an accurate representation of size, but I just want you to imagine the difference between, how much light a hole the size of a dime or a pinhole would let in to the sensor versus that of a quarter. So like it's the amount of light coming in all at once. So an aperture of f2.8 is a very large hole. That would be like a quarter size hole. And you can see, let's see, snap. You can also see that the background is very soft here. So one of the reasons for that is that light travels basically in a straight line through the lens to get to the sensor. When the aperture is really wide, light is coming in from multiple angles into the sensor, and it creates a soft background for whatever's not in focus. This would also be called a shallow depth of field. Now, if we go to the opposite end, and whenever you're playing with these things, I suggest start at the two ends and then go to the middle and then play but see what the two extremes are. So F22 would basically be like a pinhole. Oh, okay, that is a bunch of, I like that it has these little terms on this. I haven't actually read this before. Blur from camera shake. Okay, so it's suggesting, so here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna put this on a tripod. It's because we have a moving subject. Let's see if this changes this. Okay, so the background is now in focus, but the subject is still blurry. And that's because the shutter speed is not being adjusted. But right here in the middle, you can see that this is in motion because it's moving, but the girl is pretty clear. I'll come back to talking about aperture more in a second. Let's finish going through these modes. So TV is shutter priority, and so right here, so aperture controls the depth of field. That's the sharpness or the level of detail and throughout the image, background, midground, foreground, subject. Shutter speed controls motion blur. A high shutter speed will freeze motion. But notice that this is super dark. Now we're going to take it off the tripod. See the difference? There we go. Turn the tripod back on. Now we're going to go down here to a very long. So this is okay. So this is 1/4000th of a second. Typically, you want to shoot at 1/60th of a second or faster to avoid camera shake or motion blur from the human body moving. And so let's take that one. So this would be, like your typical setting in this situation. Now, if you have a really long shutter speed, this is 1 second, you're going to have a lot of blur. It's also letting in a lot more light, but there's also a lot of blur. So now we're going to go to manual mode. Now, I suggest that you all work in manual mode. That way you are forcing yourself to learn all of the settings. But it's good to know how program, aperture, and shutter priority mode work. Program is the camera making all the decisions. Aperture priority is you're just deciding on the aperture and the ISO. It will figure out the shutter speed. Shutter priority is you are deciding the shutter speed and the ISO. It will decide the aperture. And manual mode is you control everything. So first, let's take this off the tripod. Here's a picture with no tripod. Notice that the background is a little blurry. The subject's okay. Picture with the tripod. Not quite as blurry. Now we're going to keep our ISO at 100. And now notice what starts to happen as we go down to 2.8. We'll start here. This is very bright. So these three settings are called the exposure triangle, and they work together. So if you increase the size of the aperture, which is a small f-stop number. The smaller the f-stop number, the larger the aperture opening is. You have to compensate for that by moving your shutter speed or your ISO the other way. Now the ISO, you can't really go further this way because as you go up, that's going to let more light in order to reduce the amount of light so that your image is not overexposed, you're going to have to increase your shutter speed. So let's start at 200. Okay, that's still too bright. Now let's just jump all the way to 4,000. That is still too bright. So in this situation, we're going to change our lighting conditions so that we can try and get a better exposed image. But in reality, unless you're indoors, you would not be able to change the lighting. Okay, so that's a bit better, but that's a little dark. So partly cloudy, slightly overexposed, but this is pretty good to me. I prefer this over the other one. So now notice that this is moving. She's moving. Oh, flip it over now. Okay, so way too dark. So what can we do? In this situation, we're already letting in the maximum amount of light with the aperture. So we're going to have to raise our ISO sensitivity. That one was super dark, so I'm just going to jump all the way up and let's see what happens. Okay, a little overexposed, lots of grain, but okay. So, in order to reduce some of that grain, we could go down. Now it's a little underexposed, but we've got a little less grain. Really, in this situation, I think having more light is key. Now, notice that this pinwheel is clear. So this motion has been frozen. Now, if we come down here, and because we are now letting in so much more light, we have to compensate by adjusting our other settings. So I'm going to pull this all the way down. Okay, so this is way too much light. We pulled the ISO all the way down to compensate. Now we're going to have to start shifting our aperture. Still too much light, so we're just gonna jump it all the way over to the end so that we can see how these relate. Much better. So here we have the correct exposure. We've got it's lit well, but because we're using such a slow shutter speed, anything that is moving is in blur. So the girl and the pinwheel. So obviously in this situation, freezing the motion, at least to a certain extent, would be the priority. Now, you can also zoom out and zoom in and see how that relates. You can try different lighting conditions. The more light you have to work with, the easier it is for you to get the settings that you really want. So, like ideally, if I was taking this shot, I had plenty of light, but it's sunny. Yeah, that's a cute shot. Let's see, where do I want it? I think I want to kind of zoom in like this. I do want to keep this here if I can. I would like the background to be blurry. So notice it's appearing blurry right here, but if we take this shot, well, first that's too bright. Oh, come here, you reset. All right, let's fix this. Okay, so once again, super sunny, want it a little closer. I'm gonna adjust the focal length, which is the distance from the camera sensor to the subject. Our ISO is all the way down. Okay, shutter speed is here. Okay, what's that looking like? Okay, so a little overexposed. I would like the background. I know that I want the background to be a little soft. Overexposed. We're just going to jump this all the way forward. Still overexposed. So in this instance, really, the only thing I can do is if I can control my lighting, I could bring down the lighting quality to, okay, let's see, partly cloudy. Okay, partly cloudy. Looks pretty good. Slightly underexposed, but not bad. Okay, so notice right here, that the background is nice and blurry, putting emphasis on the subject. There is some motion blur here, but the girl is nice and sharp. Now, if we want detail throughout the image, we can bring this up. I'll bring it up about right here. And I'll lower my shutter speed in order to compensate, because remember, as I'm decreasing, I just decrease the amount of light that the aperture is allowing in. So I have to increase the amount of light that the shutter speed is allowing in, and that the ISO is picking up. So underexposed, we're going to have to bring up the ISO. Now let's see if we come down here, if we can get that perfect. There we go. That's pretty close for here, and you can see that this background is much sharper than in previous images. So I want to encourage you to play with these settings. If you have a DSLR, play with this here first, and then go to your DSLR and try these out. Remember, know what these mean, but manual mode is what you want to work with, and you're mostly going to be working with these three settings. I always recommend basically just setting your ISO to 100 and not changing it unless you have to. And generally, try and keep your ISO between 100 and 1600 to reduce the amount of noise that's in the image. So if you're not having to change your ISO, you're really just having to adjust your aperture and your shutter speed to control the lighting in an image. So right here you can see, so one, these are major stops. So 1, 2, 3, and generally speaking, if I just shifted this over 3, I would shift this one over 3 as well. I may have just messed that up. But for instance, if this is the correct exposure for the image, which that's not, that's a little too, let's take it down to here. Okay, but that's okay. So if this is the correct exposure for the image, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. This is an equivalent exposure, meaning that your settings are different, but the amount of light that this setting and the previous setting are letting in are the same.